Hey everybody, if you're watching, my name is Donna Imam and we're getting started here to talk about the 2020 Texas US Congressional Races and a data deep dive into all the 10 targeted races and what happened and why did Democrats not net a single seat. So that is a presentation today. If you're just joining, my name is Donna Imam. I'm the U.S. congressional nominee out of Texas's 31st district, which is North Austin, all of its suburbs, Williamson County, Bell County, and we're getting ready to get the presentation started right now, and I'll talk you through it. If you're on the chat, hopefully if you have some good questions, please do ask them. I would love to answer them as I go through this presentation. So let's get started. As I said, we are going to do a analysis of all the targeted Texas races and what happened. Why didn't we see the big blue wave that we all expected in Texas? So I'm going to give it just a couple of minutes for people are still joining the call. The call was supposed to start at 8, so we'll give it one more minute. And again, my name is Donna Imam. I just ran for U.S. Congress in Texas's 31st district, and we're today going over all the 10 targeted U.S. congressional races in Texas. Many of you may not know that. We were hoping for a big blue wave and to increase the majority of the Democrats in the U.S. Congressional House of Representatives. That didn't happen, and now we're going to go look at the data to see what really happened. Why did we lose every single race? Why did we not net a single race? That's what today's conversation is all about. So let's get started as I talk you through all this data. So before we get started, I do want to thank a couple of people. The first person I want to thank is Dahlia Dry. She came to us from Bluebonnet Data, which is a nonprofit that recruits really amazing students that want to work on data. And it's really important to point out here that Dahlia went to the trouble of going through every U.S. congressional race. So because Texas is super gerrymandered, what you're going to see is each of these congressional races, they go across multiple counties. In some cases, for example, Texas 25, we're going across 13 counties, and only a portion of the precincts are in each county. So you have to go precinct by precinct by precinct to figure out how did the top of the ticket presidential candidate do in these congressional districts versus how the congressional candidates did. And the same thing with any kind of statewide race. So if you want to look at how the Senate candidates did in a U.S. congressional race, you have to do the same thing. And so she went through that tedious task of getting all that data and helping me plot some of this data. And I also want to thank Anvita Siddharthavam, who is a high school student right here in Round Rock in Texas, which is a suburb of Austin, Texas. And she helped basically double check the numbers to make sure that our numbers were on target. One thing I do want to tell you is that most of our numbers, in fact 99.9, probably 9% of them, are actually official results that have been certified in Texas. So this is one of the sources of accurate official results and data that we have tabulated, and that's why we waited so long to get all the data. And by the way, we have to go to each county website. Sometimes they're not posted precinct by precinct. So there's a lot of work to be done to bring this data together. So I hope you'll really appreciate the work that we've done and specifically these students have done to help us get this data to you and paint the picture of what happened. One other thing I want to talk about before we get started is that there are so many volunteers on our U.S. congressional campaign that have reached out since the election to ask Donna, now what? What do we do? How do we make ourselves, get back in the game? What can we do to bring change? And the most important thing that I've heard is there are so many people that would happily take a pay cut to be able to improve the lives of Americans. And as defeated as we may feel because we didn't get the blue wave, we didn't win a single congressional race, we have to understand that there are so many people in our country that need us to make change for them. And there are so many volunteers out there that are more than happy to put their efforts in if they can see a path to bringing change to our country. So that is really, really important. I want to thank all the volunteers, including these students. So let's go through today's agenda. I have split this into 5 different topics. So done it into, first of all, we'll talk about which of the US congressional races in Texas were actually targeted. So a lot of people don't know that, but the DCCC had targeted specific races in Texas, and that is what we're going to go over today. Number 2, the second part of this is we are going to go through the results of all the races. So that's the data deep dive that I have promised all of you. And so we'll go through that, and we'll go through not just 2020, but we'll compare to what happened 4 years ago in the last presidential race, so 2016. And we'll also go into what happened in 2018. So you'll get a good understanding of what has happened over the last 6 years in Texas. The third part of it is what happens inside the race. So a lot of people, especially if you're somebody who's considering running for office, wants to know what happens inside a U.S. congressional race. How do you guys run it? How do you get support from the party? What are the things you have to do to be successful? And so this will give you a little bit of behind the scenes insight into what happens. And I have some really cool stuff to share with you, including, how some people got DCCC support and others didn't, and what it takes to get their support. So I think it's a really good insight, but I promised a data deep dive, so we're going to do that first. And so if that's all you're interested in, that's what we're going to go into first, and then we'll get into what happens inside the race. The next thing that I'm going to talk about is what went wrong. Why did we lose all of these 10 races? And we'll use the data to show you why these things happen and why none of these races were successful, including the ones that were incredibly close, including the ones that were polling as toss-up or definitely Democrat, probably Democrat, including the ones that raised lots of money, up to $10 million. So we will go into all of that. And last but not the least, we will talk about how do we win Texas? Where do we go from here? And how can we get things done moving forward? And is it really possible to turn Texas blue ever? Because it didn't happen in 2020. So, what is it that we are going to have to do to be able to get there? So let's start with the first part, which is the targeted U.S. congressional races. So a lot of people are unaware, but in Texas in 2020, we were targeting 22 state house races, 10 U.S. congressional races, and of course the Texas Senate race. And for those of you who don't know, the Texas House Democratic Campaign Committee, also referred to as the HDCC, is the organization that oversees all of the Texas House races and helps candidates win Texas House races. These are at the state level. Then you have the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which is the DCCC, also known as the DCCC rather. They are responsible for helping candidates win U.S. congressional races. These are federal races across the country to help increase our majority, the Democratic majority in the U.S. Congress. And then the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee is the DSCC, and they are the organization under the big Democratic Party umbrella that is responsible to help Senate races, Democratic Senate races, and Democratic Senate congressional candidates be successful in their races. So that's kind of where we're going with this. These are the targets. Now, one of the reasons that the 22 Texas state houses were a big focus this year, which if you're outside of Texas, you might not know this, is that if we could have gotten majority in the Texas State House, we had the opportunity to prevent gerrymandering for another decade. So as you all know, we just went through census 2020, and now we have a opportunity to redistrict. We're going to have an opportunity to redistrict. In fact, Texas is probably going to gain 2 seats, so we're going to go from whatever number of seats we have right now to about probably 38. So from 36 to 38 seats, and we had an opportunity to prevent gerrymandering. And in fact, this will be the first year, because we did not gain a single seat in the Texas State House. This will be the first time that the Texas legislator will redistrict Texas without any input or oversight from the federal government. So literally, they can do whatever they want. So this was a once in a decade opportunity. So if you were outside Texas, maybe you were paying a lot of attention to the Senate races or the presidential races or even some US congressional races. But inside Texas, we were very focused on these state house races in addition to these US congressional races. However, the whole point was we were going to target 22, and then we're going to try to flip 9 of them and see if we can take control of the Texas State House. With the US congressional races, however, we had 10 races that were targeted, with really the DCCC was really hoping that basically we flip 4 of those seats. Like if we had flipped 4 of them, they would have been really, really, really happy. So that was the focus of Texas. So if you're just joining the call, we just got through the agenda here, and I'm gonna just repeat it real quick for those of you who are joining late. So we are going through 5 sections. We're going to talk about targeted US congressional races in Texas. We're going to talk the results, which is the deep dive into this race and all the data. We're going to then talk about what happens inside the race, how you run US congressional races to win, and then what went wrong, and then we'll talk about how we win races, how we win Texas in the future. So as I was going through this, I mentioned that most of you who are on this call have been supporters of our campaign, voters within the district, or you are a donor to our campaign, or you were a volunteer on this campaign. So we will also spend a little bit of time analyzing this specific race as well. And what I want to show you is the successes that we've had and where we lacked and where we go from here. So that's the point of our discussion today. So one of the things you may be asking, especially if you're out of Texas or if you've donated to Texas races, is why was Texas such a big focus for us? The reason Texas was such a big focus in 2020 is former Representative Beto O'Rourke. In 2018, Representative O'Rourke ran for the Senate here. And as all of you know, Beto came very, very close to winning Texas and getting us a Democratic Senate seat for the first time in a long time in Texas. And whether you want to whether you're a fan of that race or not, whether you're following it or not, there is absolutely no doubt the reason that the Democratic Party was ever paying attention to Texas was because of what Beto was able to do. So whether you're for the policies that he's for, or whether you were interested in that race or not, that was the reason why 2020 ever was discussed among Democrats as a possibility of gaining seats, as a possibility of flipping Texas. So now I will go into the specific 10 races they were targeted and why they were targeted. So this is a chart of all the 10 races. So I have ranked them from 1 through 10 based on the rank of the ability to flip those races, and also the chances of them flipping, and the amount of attention that the DCCC paid to these races. So the top 4, of which 3 of them were open races, and an open race is a race where there is no incumbent. So the incumbent has and that is considered an open race. So as you can see here, in 2020, there were 3 open races: Texas 23, where we had candidate Gina Ortiz-Jones. We had Texas 24, we had candidate Candace Valenzuela, who won the nomination there. And then Texas 22, we had Sri Kulkarni. These 3 were in an open race. So these were big potential pickups for Texas because you didn't have the incumbency or the power of the incumbency in these 3 races. The the other race that was a very big target for the DCCC was Texas's 21st district, where Wendy Davis ran this time. And the reason it was such a big target is in 2018, Texas's 21st district was an open race. So you just elected someone new in this race. This race was also the closest race after Texas 23. So it was the second closest race in 2018. It was, I think, 2.4% away from flipping blue in 2018. And on top of that, you were bringing in a candidate that had national name recognition. So Wendy Davis ran for governor several years ago in Texas. So she has a lot of name ID within Texas. She's very well known. So you're bringing in a powerhouse name, and that is why those four races were targeted. The top four races were targeted. So that's what I'm showing here in this column. You can also see what happened in 2018. So for example, prior to 2020, Texas's 23rd district had Will Hurd. You've heard his name a lot. He retired. And prior to Chip Roy coming in Texas's 21st district, it was an open race. And you can see the names of the people that were here. The couple of things that I want to point out here is you can see the red bars that go across Texas's 10th district, 31st, and 25th district. These are some of the three most toughest races in Texas because they have what I call entrenched incumbents. So McCall is a 8-term GOP U.S. representative. John Carter, who I was up against, is a 9-term. He is the most entrenched GOP representative out of all these races. And then you had Roger Williams. I believe he was a 3 or 4-term GOP that's been in this race. Is also an entrenched GOP U.S. Congressional representative. That's been there. So that's what the red bars are, and you can see where the open races are. The last two lines are Texas's 32nd district and 7th district. These were protect districts for Democrats this time around because they turned blue in 2018. These were the two U.S. congressional seats that we picked up in 2018, and as you can see here, that they are already blue, so they've got incumbents next to them, but these were protect seats, and so that was really, I wanted to point out that these were also on the DCCC's radar. Now, on the last column, you'll see a line called added R to B, and R to B is what's called red to blue. So red to blue is where the DCCC puts you on a program and they help you financially and in many other ways to be able to win these races. And one of the interesting things that I want to point out is out of the 10 targeted races, you can see here 8 of these races were added to red to blue. I have Texas's 6th district with Stephen Daniel up there in red because I was not able to confirm that he was ever added to red to blue, but he was added to what they call battleground races. So originally in 2019, prior to these U.S. congressional races prior to these candidates being nominees, there were 6 races that the DCCC had identified as battlefield races, as they call them. And they were the top 4. So Texas 21, 22, 23, 24. So those are the top 4. Then there was Texas 10, which is Mike Siegel's race, and Texas 31. Those were the races that they were most focused on because these were less than 5 percentage points off in 2018. So that's how they came up with those 6. And they call them, offensive House battlefield. So in 2019, the DCCC called them, added them to offensive House battlefield. After that, the other 4 that you see up there, so 6, 31, 25, and 3, were also added eventually to both the offensive battlefield and to red to blue. The 2 races that I believe that were not added our Stephen Daniels, Texas's 6th district was never added to the red to blue program as far as I can confirm. And if you have data to show me otherwise, you can please share it with me. And of course, my race. Texas's 31st district was never added to the red to blue program. And I will go into the details and the juicy details of why it was never added. And by the way, I am in no way feel like this made any difference in our race, and I will use the data to show you why it didn't make a difference in our race. And that is why I don't think that somebody like the chair of the DCCC, Sherry Bustos, actually can be held responsible for all these losses. And I'll go into why the data shows that. And I want to say that our race wasn't lost because we didn't get DCCC support, and that is what I want to show you with the data today. So going on, next thing I'm going to talk about is all of these races had certain handicaps and certain advantages. And I want to discuss these 7 handicaps or advantages that you can have. So first of all, how are races rated? So number 1, fundraising. So the more money you can raise, the more chance that you have in winning races, obviously. And number 2 is incumbency versus an open race, which I explained before. And if you pick up any government 101 book or high school book, it will tell you that the power of incumbency is enormous, and not just because incumbents have a war chest, but also because of the name ID that they built up and the credibility that they built up for being in Congress. So that is a huge advantage, and as a challenger to an incumbent, that makes that race extremely difficult. Number 3, the entrenchment of the incumbency also makes a difference. So for example, I spoke about it earlier that Chip Roy had been elected in 2018. It's one thing to be a one-term U.S. House representative, but it's another thing to be a 9-term U.S. House representative. That means you've literally been in that district or represented that district for 2 decades. That makes a race extremely more difficult. So there are hard races and there are harder races. The next thing I want to talk about is on March 3rd, every single U.S. Congress race had a primary. So most races have a primary. So if you don't have a primary, you do not have a primary opponent, you have a much easier race because now you're not raising money and you're not spending money for that primary race. So there were, believe it or not, there were races among these 10 targeted races that did not have a primary. That's the funny part. There were races where someone had no primary, they just became the nominee. The next thing I want to talk about is a runoff. In Texas, in the primary, if you don't get 50% or more of the votes, it goes to a runoff. So let's say you have 6 people running on your race and you come to the very top, you don't automatically get the nomination unless you have more than 50% of the votes. So now that runoff in Texas in 2020 was supposed to happen on May 26th, but it happened because of the pandemic much later, in fact, 8 weeks later, exactly, on July 14th. So that is a huge delay. So imagine you are still running in a primary all the way through July 14th. You don't know whether you're the nominee or not in 2020. So there was the next thing that I want to talk about is being a first-time candidate. There were many candidates that had ran in 2020 and that were running again. And there were many candidates that were first-time candidates like myself who had never ran for office, but on top of that, have never held any elected office. So for example, if you look at Wendy Davis, she was a Texas state senator for some time here in Texas. And after that, she held elected office, and a pretty important one at that. And then on top of that, she ran statewide in this race before she ran for U.S. Congress in Texas's 21st district. And then you look at other candidates that maybe held school board or, maybe were on the city council prior to running for U.S. Congress. So that also makes a little bit of a difference in terms of credibility, name recognition, all of that. And then last but not the least is DCCC support, which I just spoke a little bit about that. Having DCCC support and true support, and the earlier you have it, the more chances that you have in being more successful because they help you in many, many different ways. So next, I'm going into how we assigned a race handicap. So I took each one of these races, as you can see on this sheet, and here is an approximation of how much money each of these races was able to raise. These are not 100% accurate because today is the filing deadline for post general, and last I checked, many people's numbers had not appeared on FEC because you still have till midnight. So these are approximations. These are numbers that were filed back on October 14th. So they're a little bit stale. That's why they have the plus sign. And you'll notice the only one that doesn't have the plus sign is my race, Texas 31, because I know exactly how much money we raised for the general race. In the second column, you will see what's called incumbency. So this is open race versus not an open race. And these have different shadings, and I'm going to get to the shade in a second here. But I just talked about that in the previous slide. The next one is entrenchment. So for example, as I mentioned, open races, of course, zero entrenchment. In this race, for example, Texas 21, this person had been elected for 1 term, and you can see many of them are 1-term races. And then you see 3 terms, 9 terms, 8 terms. So as you have more entrenchment, the color grading goes darker. Next, you have first-time candidate, held elected office or not, they are a first-time candidate, so that's that column. Then you have which candidates had a primary, which one did not. So for example, Representative Colin Allred and Lizzie Fletcher, both of them did not have a primary. But get this, in Texas's 6th district, I believe Stephen Daniel did not have a primary. So he kind of got that nomination and didn't have to spend any money. Now, here's the worst case scenario. Out of all these races, you can see 3 of these races had runoffs on top of that. So not only are you now spending money again, yet another. So here's the thing, right? I know that many of you are going to look at the slide and you're going to be like, oh yeah, so Donna, you've given yourself this handicap and you've calculated this handicap. But what I want to show you is how I gave myself the handicap and how I did the handicap. And if you don't agree with the handicap, by the way, you can assign your own handicaps, by the way. So you don't have to agree with my analysis of the data. So I wanted you to know that. But the way we did this is this. If you had an open race, for example, you are dark green. And if you had lots of name recognition and were not a first-time candidate, you were dark green. If you didn't have a runoff, you were dark green. So dark greens were these were positive. So these were basically advantages that you had in a race. So you were given a -1 for your handicap. And as things got worse, you were given a higher number for the handicap. So this number here was gotten by adding up all the numbers you got here. So even if you don't agree with my handicap number, and you don't have to, you can agree with the shading. And the one thing that really stands out is Texas's 31st district in terms of the handicap, in terms of the money raised, which was less than $1 million at the end, in terms of the incumbency, the length of the incumbency, being a first-time candidate, having a primary and a runoff, which was delayed, not ever being added to red to blue, is you can see a really, really strong red line through the middle of this plot, this chart. Now, the top 4, remember I told you how did I rank these, this 2020 rank? You can see that if you look at the top 4 races, there are more green blocks up here than there are down here, both in terms of the amount of money that each of these candidates were able to raise. So if you compare the top 4 to the bottom 6, the only one that really stands out is Seema's race. She was able to raise quite a bit more than the rest of us on the bottom, and there's a little bit of reason for that. But in general, you'll see the top 4 had more money, and they had more money because they had DCCC support very early on. So one thing I want to show you here is that in Gina's case, she was put on red to blue back in January 28, even though she had a primary, didn't have a runoff, but they were really serious about this race. And the same thing with Wendy. You'll see here, Candace was put on red to blue on July 16th. Remember, July 14th was when we had the runoff. So 2 days after the runoff, the DCCC immediately put her on red to blue. And that makes a huge difference in the amount of money you are able to raise because the DCCC basically points your rate, points big donors, Democratic donors, to your race. And by the way, when I talk about Democratic donors, and many of you are donors to my campaign, by the way, but there are Democratic donors that donate in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Let me repeat that. hundreds of thousands of dollars. That means they give the maximum amount, $2,800 in 2020, to multiple U.S. congressional races, Senate races, presidential races over and over again. That's how wealthy some of these donors are. So it makes a huge difference whether you get red to blue or not. Now, if you look at this chart, you'll see someone like a Mike Siegel in Texas's 10th district. He was put on red to blue literally less than a month before the election, the general election. October 7th, October 13th is when early voting started in Texas. So what can you do with money that you get while early voting is happening? Literally very little time to influence. Not to mention that once early voting has started, now you are competing for the attention amongst the presidential race, the Senate race, multiple U.S. congressional races, because remember, in Texas, these districts are gerrymandered. So if you live in Austin, for example, okay, you're going to see the ads of a dozen candidates playing on TV. And if you're on Facebook or digital or whatever, and you're seeing digital ads, you're going to see ads from half a dozen, if not a dozen candidates at the same time vying for your attention. So what I'm trying to say is that getting red to blue later on in the game doesn't make sense. And this is one of the reasons that we stopped trying to get red to blue for our campaign, because we realized that if you didn't get it by at least by the time you'd won your nomination, so for me that would have been July 14th or July, or even in August, the money that comes in after like September becomes less and less usable, and you're just really wasting donor money. And that was something that I was not willing to do. Not that it would have made a difference, by the way, but let's keep going. So the next slide I want to go to, I want to get into the results. So we are past the targeting conversation. We're into the results now. So let's dig into the data. And so one of the things I want to talk about is in 2016, to set you up for results, Democrats picked up 4 Texas House seats. Trump won 9 of these 10 targeted 2020 U.S. congressional districts. So it was a big feat. So in 2016, when Trump was at the top of the ticket, Trump won 9 of these 10. So this is a big challenge. In 2018, however, the reason why we were even talking about a big blue wave in Texas in 2020 was Democrats flipped 12 Texas House seats. 12. What an amazing result. And 2 U.S. congressional House seats, the 2 on the bottom of my charts that I showed you before. And Beto O'Rourke won 3 of the 10 targeted 2020 U.S. congressional districts. So that is why we are talking about 2020. But what happened in 2020? Democrats netted 0 gains in Texas. We lost our margin of majority in the U.S. House, but big time. Trump still won 9 of the 10 targeted U.S. congressional districts in Texas. And that is one of the biggest takeaways from this race, that Trump not only expanded the electorate, brought out more Republicans and got millions of more votes in 2020, but he won those same 9 of 10 targeted U.S. congressional districts. So that is one of the biggest things that I want to show you and what happened. In terms of the House seats, we didn't net a single Texas House seat, by the way. We did get 1 and we lost 1, so it turned out to be even. So let's go into the data. So right now you're looking at 2020 results here. And so I want to go over what happened here. So on column 1, you will see how much the president won by, so top of ticket. And out of all these races, if I'm looking at this column here, right here, you will see that Biden won 1 of the congressional districts, which was Texas 24. So this data is really not available anywhere else. As I said, we had to go through every single precinct and every single county that's in these congressional races and find out how many votes he got. And Biden won it by 5.55%. And so one of the things I do want to point out here is that we normalize all of this data, which means we threw out all non-Republican and Democratic data. So when we say he won by 5.55%, we mean Biden minus Trump equals this. And if you add up the total Biden and Trump votes, we call that 100%. So that's how all of this data is. It's been normalized in this way. It doesn't matter how you look at the data, but this is the simplest way to look at the percentages. So you can see here, Biden won both of Colin Allred and Lizzie Fletcher's district, and they held their seat as well. You can also see that the U.S. Senate candidate, MJ Hagar, also won these two districts. And then you can see that the incumbents, Colin Allred and Lizzie Fletcher, actually won their districts by even a bigger margin than the Senate candidate did. But one of the biggest takeaways here is that not only did the U.S. rep lag Biden's loss number, but here you can see that they won, that even the incumbents, even that they won and they held their races, they are behind Biden's portion of the win. So you can see that they're behind. And by the way, a lot of times when people report this data, what they do is they make these positive and they just color them blue. I don't like doing that. I like to show that these are indeed negative results, meaning that the positive results are where Republicans won and the negative results are where Democrats won. So that's where you're seeing this here. So the key takeaway from here is that every single U.S. House rep, here in the last column is lagging behind where Biden was. And the closest one that came, so you might have heard that Candace's race took a little while to call, and she did not concede for several weeks. And one of the reasons is that it was a very close race, 1.38%. Biden actually won her district, so this had a very, very good chance of winning. The other race I want you to look at is Gina Ortiz-Jones, Congressional District 23, and here you can see that it was extremely close. So Biden almost won this race. And when you look at 2018 data, you'll see how Beto did and how Clinton did in 2016 as well. So this is the biggest takeaway from this. And what I did here also is I want to talk about a couple of things. So before we move on. So one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of people come in and they vote for president and they leave. So they don't vote down ballot at all. So for example, in my race, you'll see a drop of almost 8,000 votes. So 8,000 more people voted in the Biden-Trump race than they voted in the Senate race or down ballot from there. And it just drops off after that. That is a very common phenomena, whether you look at 2020 or any other race. So that's number one. Number two, in Texas, what happened in 2020, for the first time, we removed straight ticket voting. So you actually had to go through the entire ballot to be able to vote for all the candidates. You could not click on one button that voted for everybody. And anecdotally, I've heard this, I don't know if this is true or not, but apparently a lot of people voted for Biden and felt like that was their one check for the Democratic Party, and it didn't go down ballot all the way. I do not know if that is true, and I don't have any data to support that. But bottom line is we actually don't know what was the impact of removing straight ticket voting. So the next slide here, what I've done is I plotted this for you so that you could kind of see what was happening. And here you can kind of see with the bar graph next to each other. Let me just put it back on just the slide so you can see. So the purple here is Biden, and these are the three races he won. These last two are 32 and 7. So these are Colin Allred's and Lizzie Fletcher's districts, and 24 is Candace's district right here. And you can see right here the delta between Biden and the U.S. congressional candidate in that race. And in general, you can always see them lagging behind by quite a bit. Whether you look at Texas 22 and Texas 21, it's a little bit less, but everybody is lagging. And there, a couple of outliers here in Texas 2 and Texas 3, where the amount behind Biden is a little bit longer. But in general, the point here is that none of these U.S. congressional candidates had any chance, because if the top of the ticket can't win, it is really impossible with the drop-off and people's attention being on the presidential race to have a chance at winning these races. So next slide is I want to show you how we compared to 2016. So in 2016, and I kept the handicaps here so you could kind of remember, you can see what happened. This is 2020. So this is how much we lost by in our own US congressional races, right? So this is straight up Republican candidate, GOP candidate minus Democratic candidate. These are the margins that we lost by, and Texas 31 is outlined here. R minus D 2016, this is Clinton's loss percentage or gain percentage. And here's the interesting thing. Remember I said that Biden won Texas's 24th district, but he actually lost Texas's 23rd, but Clinton had won Texas's 23rd district by 3.54%. And believe it or not, Clinton had also won in 2016 Colin Allred's districts and Lidgy Fletcher's district by a much smaller percentage, but they were winning. She already won there. The point here is that these districts were either flip districts or very much bordering on blue, or they were changing significantly in some way. Now, what I'm comparing here is 2016 Clinton to 2020 U.S. congressional candidate to see how much of a gap did the U.S. congressional candidate in these races close the gap from Clinton. And now, many of you may be asking, why am I comparing 2016? And the reason is this. You really can't look at 2018 data. And the reason you can't look at 2018 data by itself is 2018 was a mid-year race. Remember, in 2018, the GOP had the presidency, they had majority in the House of Representatives, and they had majority in the US Senate. So in 2018, the incentive for Republicans to come out and vote was much lower than it was in 2016 or 2020, where you had a presidential race, number one, so stakes are much higher. And number two, you had the same Republican GOP candidate, which was Trump. You had Trump at the top of 2020, top of the ticket on 2016, and you had Trump at the top of the ticket in 2020. So logically, if you're going to compare, if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this entire presentation, that if you're doing data analysis and you want to compare how the U.S. congressional candidate, comparing them to 2018 data does not make sense. And so the next thing you guys are going to tell me is, well, why are you comparing to top of ticket? Why aren't you comparing to how the Democratic U.S. congressional nominee did back in 2016? And there's a reason for that. And I'm going to get to it, why we're not comparing them and comparing Clinton. So let me go back and show you what happened with Clinton. So as you can see here, of all the races, I ranked them. And you can see the person who closed the race the most from Clinton was Candace Valenzuela in Texas's 24th district. In Texas's 24th district, she closed the race by 5.18%. Now, I want to bring to your attention, look at her handicap. It's kind of light green. So she had few handicaps. And again, you know, the handicap column is completely debatable. So debate it all you like, put your own handicaps there. But she performed the best with respect to top of the ticket. And number two is Texas's 31st district. We closed the gap by 4.16%. So basically on this column here, 2016 to 2020, you are looking for the higher number. The higher the number, the better the performance of the U.S. congressional candidate from 2016 to 2020. Now, I do want to set one thing straight. Some of this performance has very little to do with the candidate. It has to do with how much money you raise, how much name ID you have, how much persuasion you have, how well of a campaign you ran. But the most important thing is these districts are changing. We talk about Texas all the time and about how Texas is changing demographically. People are moving around. Austin has grown into a huge big city, and over the last 4 years, my district has changed. One of the reasons that I ran for Congress, by the way, is because I believe that the change in my district was significant. And if we could just get out the vote, if we could just increase the number of people who came out to vote and let Democrats see that they had a real choice, we could win this race. That's why I ran. And one of the reasons that our campaign performed at the top of all of these 10 campaigns, and more importantly, if you take the handicap into account, this is literally the biggest bang for your buck in terms of votes that you could get. 176,000 votes, the most votes that any Democratic nominee in this district has ever gotten, 40,000 more than any other Democratic candidate has ever gotten. And last time, and then of course there's a how much money you raised, which wasn't to our advantage. So bottom line is that if you compare the data apples to apples, our campaign, if you supported our campaign, if you voted for our campaign, if you volunteered on our campaign, if you donated to our campaign, this success is your success. I want you to know that the work you did, the money you gave us when you came out to vote for us, it was not in vain. We had every single thing stacked against us, and yet we came in number 2, stacked against all 10 US congressional races with 0 DCCC support. That's thanks to you guys. All right, so moving along, I also plotted this data so you could kind of see it. And of course, you can look at this closer, but here again, you can see the delta between Clinton and the US congressional races, and you can see which ones Clinton won. The one thing I want to point out is Texas 32. Here's the funny thing. In 2016, Clinton won Texas 32. I mean, not by much, but she won it. But there was no Democratic candidate. Imagine that. Nobody ran in that district. That's what it was. So now I'm going to show you why I did not compare the US congressional candidate in 2016 to the US congressional candidate in 2020. So this is what will give you a very good idea. So if you do compare the US congressional candidates, here is how the US congressional candidate, so column number 1 right after the handicap is how the US congressional candidate did in 2020. Column number 2 is how the US congressional candidate did in 2016. And if you look at these numbers, you can see that the losses were almost all of them were in double digits, other than Texas 23, which is considered a flip district or a swing district. Yeah, double digits. Let that sink in. Why are they double digits? Because in 2016, these candidates did not run serious races where they were vying to win, and that is the truth. And the way you can tell that is by looking at the amount of money that they raised. So this was the Democratic candidate. This was the money they raised, and as you can see, what a huge difference between 2016 and 2020. Nobody raised more than $100,000 for the entire race. So these were not serious races being run, other than Texas 23, where Representative Pete Galeo ran, and he did raise, I think, something like $4 million. Don't hold me to the fundraising numbers, because this is I did a quick search on the internet to see how much people raised. But bottom line is, in 2016, these were not serious U.S. congressional races, and that is why I did not compare this race to that, because if I had, then I would have closed the gap in my race by 13.69%. I would still be number 3 in terms of ranking straight up with the most handicaps. So Texas's 31st district would have still overperformed in a big way with respect to 2016. But bottom line, this is the reason why I did not do that, and this is why I am comparing it to top of ticket, because obviously 2016 was a huge talked about race between Trump and Clinton, and pretty much everybody in the United States and across probably the world had heard about that race. So that's why I didn't do it. So that's the sort of explanation of why we should compare those. But I know that you guys will not let me off the hook until I show you 2018, because some of you are still like, well, Donna, how did Beto do so well in 2016? And how did we gain so many state house races? And how did we gain, flip 2 congressional races? So I will go into that, and I will show you what happened in 2018. as well. So this is the 2020 final results. I don't think we need to spend too much time on this, but I looked at the Senate race as well, and I looked at how the U.S. rep lagged the Senate race as well. This is more detailed data you can look at, but I think the main point to take away from the 2020 is that other than a couple of outliers, Texas 2 and Texas 3, pretty much everyone, and you're looking at this president minus rep again, is hovering between 1 and 3 points from top of ticket. So everyone is lagging Biden by 1 and 3 points. And if Biden is unable to win these races, we had no chance. Even with, over 75% voter turnout in my district, it just did not happen. Because if Biden can't win my district, there's no way I can win this district either. All right. So here we go, 2018. Just to humor all of you 2018 guys, the big takeaway here is you can look in 2018, Beto actually outperformed Biden in many different races. So for example, Beto won Texas's 23rd district by 5 points. He won Candace Valenzuela's Texas 24th district. Obviously, Candace was not running in 2018. Here is the 2018 candidate right here. And you'll see here in Texas 10, Beto won Texas 10, and he won 32 and 7, which were flipped by Colin Allred and Lizzie Fletcher by a huge amount. So Beto won 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these 12 races, and of these 10 races, he won 3, and Biden only won 1. Which means there's a lot of potential for Texas's 24th district because the top of the ticket seems to be consistently winning year after year here, although it did not look good when Clinton ran in 2016. So this column here is Biden minus Beto, and you can see that Beto marginally did better than Biden in multiple races, basically 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 8 out of the 12 races. 8 out of the 12 races. And here I have how much money that these candidates, these 2018 candidates raised, so that you can see how serious these races were. And you can see here, Texas's 23rd district in 2018 was a serious race, $6 million. Texas's 21st district, upwards of $3.2 million. Joseph Kopser, who ran in that race, a pretty big talked about race here in Austin. Sri Kulkarni, these black names are names of candidates that ran twice. So for example, Sri Kulkarni ran in 2018, ran again. Mike Siegel ran again. MJ ran for Senate. She did not run again for the same U.S. Congressional District, but Julie ran again. So these are second-time candidates that ran in 2020, pretty much running for, more than 3.5 years. So this is a pretty significant investment on their time. And then I have a little plot for you to kind of see as well. If some of you are visual and you want to see the data more visually, this is Clinton versus Beto O'Rourke versus Biden and how they did. And you can see it's very consistent, but in terms of wins and losses. But the point I'm trying to make here is that unless we win at the top of the ticket, we cannot win this U.S. congressional race. And that is the biggest takeaway from all of this. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about Texas's 31st district before we get on to the next section, because I know that many of you supported this race and want to see a little bit more detail in this race. And I'm going to share some good news with you at this point. So here's the good news here. This is the performance of our race right here. In 2016, Clinton got this many votes. And in 2018, Beto got this many votes, 22,000 more votes than Clinton in this same district. And in 2020, our campaign got 37,000 more votes than what Beto got in 2018. So at the beginning of this race, before the results came out, you remember I talked about the growth of this district, the change in the demographics of this district, and why we believe we could win this district. Well, we know for a fact, and I'm comparing myself here to the top of the ticket. I'm not comparing myself to the U.S. congressional race candidate in 2018 because the results look even better, but you'll see that in the next slide. My point is this. We got out the vote. We got so many more Democrats out, but Trump expanded the electorate and he really got out more people to come out and vote for him, especially in my district. We had more than 110,000 more votes cast in this district, one of the highest voter turnouts ever. I think the highest voter turnout, over 75% of registered voter turned out to vote. And we got those votes. So that is a huge accomplishment in itself in terms of the votes. And in total, if you compare between 2016 and 2020, almost 60,000, nearly 60,000 more Democratic votes. That is astounding that there are actually 60,000 more Democrats. Now we know, here's the funny thing, now we know 60,000 more Democrats actually do live in this district, and we need to get it out. So that's the new bar, that we got to get these Democrats out to come out and vote, and not believe that this district can be flipped, because it can. So if you look at the next one, this is comparing US congressional candidate to candidate, and I put fundraising numbers next to the candidate so you can see what happened. From 2016 to 2018, the number of more Democratic votes that was gotten by the US congressional candidate was 32,000. And the amount of money that was raised was 5.1 million. Now, I want you to know that not all 5.1 million was spent in the general race. Some of it was spent in the primary, but a very tiny amount. The bottom line is $5.1 million got you 32,000 more votes. We raised less than $1 million. My target was raising $1 million for the general. We were able to raise only $750,000. We got nearly 40,000 more votes than 2018. The voter turnout was amazing, and we got those people to vote in our race. 72,000 more votes than 2016. And the biggest takeaway I want you to take from this is that millions and millions and millions of dollars, there is a return of investment that after a certain amount of investment that you do not get, doesn't matter how much money you spent. This is why I said that if we could raise $1 million, we could win this race, which is the promise that I made. Having looked at the results, I don't think that's true, because you have to have Biden win the race. But bottom line is, there is I forget the term, but the return, the diminishing return on investment after a certain amount of money is extremely important to pay note here. That with much less money, we got much more votes. Obviously, this is look, I get it. This is a presidential race. A lot more people came out. Trump is an extremely polarizing candidate at the very top of the ticket. So I get all of that. But keep in mind that you don't need to raise millions and millions of dollars to win US congressional races. And what we showed here is that even candidates like Wendy Davis with amazing name recognition and being a former elected, Texas state senator and $10 million did not make impact in the 2020 US congressional races. This wasn't about money. It wouldn't have mattered if I'd gotten DCCC support. It wouldn't have mattered if I had a $10 million. We wouldn't have won, because we have data to show that people who had $10 million and had all of that and ran a campaign with all the staff and all the consultants and all the items that the DCCC wants you to have could not win. And we'll get into that why, and I'll show you what the data says. But before we do that, the last thing I want to show you, and this is a really, really interesting slide, is that in 2016, the U.S. congressional candidate, which raised very little money, was trailing Clinton by 6%. That was at the top of the ticket, and also the ticket right before U.S. Congress, meaning that there was no Senate race in 2016 in Texas. In 2018, MJ Hagar raised a lot of money, $5 million, and she trailed Beto by 1%. So Beto was at the top of her ticket. This was the Senate race. And right after that, on your ballot, you would see the U.S. congressional race, and she trailed by 1%. Get to 2020, and you look at the ticket right above me, which was U.S. Congress, and then Senate, which was now Hagar, because she was running for U.S. Senate. Well, look at the trail, 1%. Even with more than 100,000 votes cast, the trail behind the ticket right behind you is still 1%, regardless of how much money you raised. So if you raise really tiny amount of money in a general, you're still going to get majority of the Democratic votes. You might, he probably would have closed the 6% gap if he had raised a little bit more money, because that's name ID. But look at the difference in the amount of money that these two races raised, and look at the drop off from the federal race right before that. It is identical. In fact, if you look at the data, in one of the two counties, we actually performed better than what Hagar did. But that's not the point. The point is that in a general race, the top of the ticket and where the top of the and the amount of influence of the top of the ticket is extremely, extremely big. It does not matter what your message is. It does not matter how much money you raise. It does not matter how well you run your race. And by the way, I ran my race. I was intimately involved in every single detail of my race because I did not want to emerge from this and blame someone else for losing. The only person that I wanted to blame for losing my race was myself. And that is why I ran my own race. I managed my own race. I made every single decision that was important in my race. And yet, we have no chance if the top of the ticket does not prevail. So that brings us to the next section of our presentation. And we're a little over an hour, but really we have the best part left, which is what happens in the race. So if you are going to run for office, this might be really, really interesting to you, but I will also share some very juicy behind the scenes details. So if you're not tired, stay on, because I think this is the fun part, and I'll tell you what went wrong and how we win Texas, because guess what? We can win Texas. So what happens inside a race? So two things that I want to talk about is when you talk about running in a race, you talk about something called candidate viability. And candidates really only have two items that they can control. One is name ID. So people have heard about you, people know about you, people have heard your name. That's what name ID is. Like, have I heard about this person? Okay. Number two is persuasion, which is getting the vote. So now they know about you, are they going to vote for you? And as I showed before, that in a general race, most people are voting party lines. So Democrats vote for Democrats, Republicans vote for Republicans, and independents vote for one or the other, depending on which side they fall on. So when we say independents come out in certain elections and don't come out in other elections, and they vote one way or the other. And there is a very, very, very small percentage of independents that split tickets. It is extremely rare. It happened in 2020, but it happened because Trump was an extremely polarizing candidate. But in general, when independents come out, they either vote Republican or Democrat. It is very uncommon for independents to split ballots down the ballot. And you will hear some people who believe, they are independents, and they'll say, oh, I don't vote by party, I vote by the person. But there are very few people that are going ballot by ballot, looking at name by name and trying to figure out, is this person good? Do I like their platform? Am I going to vote for them? The percentage of people that are that engaged in politics is minor. In fact, those of you who are listening, if I asked you to name all 36 US Congressional Representatives from Texas, you wouldn't be able to. In fact, if I asked you some of the judges, some of the local races who were running in them, you would not be able to name their names. It is extremely difficult to know all the people on your ballot. And I think that is very important to understand, that if you're going to run for a race, there are two things that you're fighting for: name ID and persuasion. And in a general race, there's only so much persuasion you can do at the Democratic, not at the Democratic, but at a down ballot level. Persuasion is something that is done at the party level. Name ID is really only what you have control over. That means letting people know that you exist. So I'm going to talk through some of the things. I want to talk through some of these items inside the party, and as I said, the juicy details. So number one, party help, DCCC. So one of the requirements for the DCCC is to use DC-based consultants to do your finance, to do your strategy, to do your media, to do your mail, to do polling. These are some of the requirements that they want you to have in order to get DCCC support. So you just don't get it because you got the nomination and they think your race is winnable and you're a great candidate. Number one, the DCCC likes to have a say in who actually wins. They like to pick their candidates if they can. If they can't, they want you to use their media firm, their advertising firm, their consultants. And it's important to them because they are helping you with fundraising. But more importantly, it is important for them to make sure that these consultants, their livelihood depends on the DCCC, giving you money and how much money you raise. So it's extremely, extremely important. So they will ask you to hire a DCCC also recommended staff. So for example, one of the things the DCCC likes to do is they like to give you somebody to run your campaign, a campaign manager or a finance director, the key staff. They want it to be people that they recommend. They don't want you to just take anybody. And part of this is the control of the party over employment into these roles. So imagine if you are recommended by the DCCC and you go on a race, what are you going to do? The DCCC got you that job. You are loyal to them. You have to be loyal to them because if you're not, they're not going to place you in the next job and the next job. And people who do these jobs that work on U.S. congressional candidate campaigns, they're dependent on the DCCC to get these jobs. For them, it's a livelihood. For them, whether they win or, whether that race wins or loses, they still get paid. These DC consultants all get paid. So you can raise $10 million and guess what? It goes to these media firms. Media firms take a cut, 15% of every single TV advertising that you see. They take a cut, 50% of every single digital ad that you see. Every single one of them. So if you spend $4 million on TV ads, they get 15% of $4 million. And with $4 million, that would be probably too much money for a digital campaign in a congressional race. You probably couldn't spend $4 million. You could probably spend maybe $1 million if you were just advertising every single place you possibly could. So the amount of money that you make on digital ads is a lot less than you make on TV ads because TV ads are way, way more expensive. Are you getting the drift here? Why does the DCCC want you to hire these people? Because that's how they're employed, and in return, these consulting firms are owned by big Democratic donors. It is a revolving door of money and money and money exchanging hands, staying in the same circles. So that is number one. Number two, you need to have full transparency with the DCCC. They want you to raise money and spend it as fast as you're raising it. So if you raise $500,000 this month, they want you to use up as much as that money and spend it as much. They do not like seeing candidates who are banking money and spending it on just voter contact, which is what our campaign did, by the way. So number two, one of the biggest problems with the DCCC is that they are asking Democratic candidates to do 40 hours of call time. So those of you who don't know what call time is when you get on the phone, you call a donor and you're cold calling them and saying, hey, I'm Donna Imam and I'm running for US Congress in Texas's 31st district. This race is so close. Can you donate some money? They want you to do that for 40 hours. So think about it this way. You have a Democratic challenger in a race that's already disadvantaged because they're up against a GOP incumbent. And that GOP incumbent only has to pick up the phone and he can raise $100,000 with one phone call with corporate PAC money, donor money, and PAC money, organizations, GOP organizations. They are literally having to do no call time. So if a U.S. congressional candidate is doing 40 hours of call time a week, okay, when do they have time to campaign and engage with voters and really have conversations with voters and go into their district, understand what their district needs, and run a real good race? They don't want you to. They want you to hire the consultants to run your race, and they want you to raise money. As a U.S. congressional candidate, you are just a conduit to raise money for DC consultants, and DC consultants get paid whether you win or lose. So this is one of the biggest disadvantages of running as a challenger, number one. Number two, most of the incumbents have no primaries, or they easily win their primaries with no runoff. So challengers, especially like myself, and you saw the chart before, we're going in my primary. I had 5 other candidates, 6-way primary, okay, with people in that primary who had ran before, who had ran district-wide. There were elected officials in there. That's a tough race just to come out of a primary. Well, guess what? The GOP incumbent doesn't have that. So there's a lot of disadvantages. If you're thinking of running for office, these are some of the things that you should keep in mind. So I want to talk about a couple of other quick things here. So, there's organizing, and organizing is about getting, volunteers out to help you go door to door, canvassing, and all that kind of stuff. Then there's voter registration. And voter registration, which is not automatic in many states, is about going and getting people registered to vote. And Texas is one of the toughest places to run it's tough. One of the toughest places that you have to go get registered every time you move. And of course, if you're moving from out of state and coming in, you're trying to always register voters. But here's the thing. One of the things that the Democratic Party does is that they really emphasize voter registration. Okay, great. You're registering voters, and so is the other side. What are we doing to persuade people who are already registered? Even with the highest voter turnout in my district, 75%, close to 200,000 people, maybe 150,000 rather, people in my district have never voted. These are registered voters, and they have never voted. So there's a lot of potential for persuasion. And one of the things that I think is that we overcurve on voter registration and not on persuasion. There are more Democrats in this district that we can get out, and we were not able to. And that is an important thing for us to do here in Texas, because we got high voter turnout and we lost. And of course, there are events. Events were very challenging because of the pandemic, as you know, but all of us switched to digital events and were able to do pretty well. I think most US congressional races had no challenges on events. I want to talk about media. Earned media is what they called when you get someone to write an article for you. The press writes an article, or you get a TV interview, for example. Couple of things I want to bring to light. First of all, when you're a U.S. congressional candidate in a primary, especially if you're in a 6-way primary, nobody takes you seriously. Nobody cares. Not even the local newspapers are paying attention to you. They may write about you. They may mention your name, but you're literally getting 0 earned media. And people get really hung up on that. They really get hung up on newspaper endorsements. One of the things that I always used to get asked about is, why don't you give more interviews? Why are you not competing for endorsements? Because the fact is, and the data shows, that the endorsements don't matter. The person who got the biggest newspaper endorsement in my primary did not win. The person who had $10 million and got all the endorsements of all the people, of all the newspapers, did not win. So don't get hung up on newspaper endorsements and earned media. People really get hung up on earned media. And the reason is, back in the day, people actually used to read the newspaper. Nowadays, the number of people that actually read the newspaper and learn about you is so minuscule. You are literally not reaching anybody under 45 with a newspaper. So this whole idea that earned media is somehow going to make you extremely popular and everyone's going to come out and vote for you is completely mythical. It's 100% mythical. Unless you are absolutely popular on your own accord, not running for political office before you ran, and you became very famous or went viral prior to that, you will never get that kind of name ID through earned media. You'll get nothing close to it. So if you're an astronaut, Mike Kelly, that is a total different game. If you're Oprah, and everybody in the United States knows who Oprah is, that is a total different case than a U.S. congressional candidate running in a 6-way race or even in a 2-way general race. You think you're going to get name recognition with earned media? You are not. I can guarantee you that Wendy Davis, in her race, was not only interviewed by every newspaper, she had a one-on-one interview with Evan Smith, the CEO of Texas Tribune. Guess what? We didn't win that race. We did not win Texas's 21st district. So this myth about earned media, we got to put aside. And people in the Democratic Party, in local Democratic clubs, are obsessed over earned media. And polling, I'm going to get to that next, does not matter. So I want to talk about actually polling before messaging. These got swapped around. But one of the other things that donors ask about all the time is, how are you polling, Donna? How's the race looking? You know? And we do a lot of polling. We did a lot of internal polling. We did a lot of internal research. And our polling looked really good, by the way. It showed us winning. But polling is not an exact science, and I'll tell you why. We are looking at VAN data. This is the voter rolls of Texas, and it has lots of phone numbers. So we're calling these people. What we know is that the data inside VAN is extremely poor. That means you may call 20 people and get through to one person. That person is uninterested, doesn't want to talk to you, and any kind of data you do get out to them is suspect. So polling is a complete waste of money in US congressional races. By the way, the DCCC requires you to pony up $45,000 and do a poll before they'll even consider you for putting you on red to blue. So that is an important point that I want to get across. If you're going to spend money on polling, that you're not going to get a lot about it. So next, I guess there's some questions coming in. Let's see, are there any questions? I'm just looking at the question here. Yeah. So, so some of you are saying that, hey, earned media is free, so you should take it. Earned media is not free. You still have to go and do the interview. You have to prep for the interview. You have to make sure that you are on point, everything. And I'm not saying, by the way, we didn't do our media. We had some really good articles written. I ran on a very strong economic message, and a couple of people did good by me. They really did listen, and they wrote some articles. But some of them were crazy, and some of them had a lot of wrong information. But the thing with earned media is that you get very little national presence. And earned media helps you get money. It doesn't necessarily help you with votes. That's what I'm trying to get to. And yes, you're right. Some good media can get you money, but it doesn't necessarily get you votes. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is messaging, because this is a very, very important thing about inside a congressional race. And I want to talk about this because this leads right into our next part, which is what went wrong. So messaging comes in different ways. There's digital. Digital is, you can run digital ads, which are like little videos that you run in all kind of digital media that people are watching, YouTube, Hulu, you name it, Facebook, Instagram, anything that's on your phone basically, or on your computer for that matter, or on your tablet. But bottom line, you're not watching on TV. There's TV and there is mail. And one of the biggest problems with the way that Democrats, of course, I don't know how Republicans run their U.S. congressional campaigns, but they overcurve on TV. They are spending millions and millions of dollars on TV advertising. You do not reach people under 45 with TV advertising. People under 45 don't watch TV at all. It's a very small percentage of people you're getting. You're getting a big chunk of people over 65, and you're getting some percentage of people between 45 and 65. I don't know what that is, but it is, the return on investment on TV is very minimal. I think you get some on digital, but again, the problem is if you're spending the last three months of your race actually advertising to build up name, ID, and persuasion within those last 3 months is very, very difficult, because there's something to be said for length. So remember I talked about incumbency and the power of incumbency, and if you pick up a basic government book for high school, you'll see they'll talk about incumbency in a big way. The important thing is that if you get your name out over time, and especially if you get it out across the general audience early on, you have a better chance of increasing name ID. So that is a very important part of messaging. So a lot of people around the country want to know what went wrong, and did that have anything to do with the negative messaging towards Democrats and all the messaging that happened that put Democrats on the defense. And what I'm going to show you right now is what went wrong and what we could have done different, and what would have made a difference and what didn't make a difference. So that is the next part of this. So what went wrong? So number one is that the biggest myth in all of this, and I'm telling you this from inside and outside, because I I may not be super political, but I have been following politics for a long time. I really enjoy following politics. But there is a myth that somehow messaging at the US congressional level cost the races. I can tell you this definitively, local level messaging did not have any impact in the race. And the fact that, and if you think that more money would have won these races, you are wrong. And the example is, I showed you multiple races. Gina Ortiz-Jones, Wendy Davis raised almost $10 million, probably more than that, $6 million, $4 million, $4+ million in Sri Kulkarni's race, Candace's race, $4 million. Money was not a factor in losing these races, and neither was messaging. For those of you that are out there saying, you know, it depends on your ideology and where you are on the Democratic spectrum. And as you guys know, I don't like using names to label who's who. But my point is this: whether you ran on what's called a perceived left-wing or moderate or centrist or center-right messaging, it had absolutely no impact. And I'll tell you this, and I'll be very frank with you. Out of the 12 Texas US House races that we flipped in 2018, we held on to all of them. And not only that, we had 4 races right here in Austin, House District 52, 136, and then Vicki Goodwin's race, I don't know the number of her race, and Lizzie Fletcher's race. All 4 incumbents, flips in 2018, held their races. And the messaging against them regarding defund the police was strong. There was negative TV advertising. There was big black signs all over Williamson County against the HD 52 and 136 candidate. They both held on to their seats with wider margins. The GOP is going around saying that they won this race because Democrats wanted to defund the police. And the data says BS. That is not what happened. In fact, the US congressional candidates that ran, centrist candidates in Texas, for example, Wendy Davis, she ran on the same platform that Biden did, okay? Expanding ACA, very centrist ideas, right? Getting more healthcare coverage. She wasn't going around saying cancel student loan debt even, right? And had $10 million. And that race was a close race, 2.4% in 2018. Was not able to win. Messaging at the US congressional level is completely blacked out. There was, you know, you couldn't turn on the TV in my district, in my what's called media market, without seeing a MJ Hagar or a Wendy Davis advertisement for 2.5 months straight. Okay? And there was negative advertising against all candidates, all Democratic candidates. But incumbents held their seats because those areas were already blue. They have more Democrats in those areas. There are less Republicans. Democrats came out. We got out the vote. They voted and they held onto their seats and they expanded. So this whole idea that somehow local messaging of candidates that ran on a certain message, quote unquote, progressive message, lefty message, had an impact on this race is completely wrong. If the top of the ticket didn't win big, you could not win because you just didn't bring out enough Democrats. By the way, the person who did the best was Candace Valenzuela. And Candace Valenzuela ran on a fairly centrist platform, by the way. However, she is over and over perceived in the media as someone who ran on a left platform. And that tells you right there. And she also, by the way, performed really well. The perception is that she ran on a very left extreme platform, and there were ads against Candace Valenzuela, I'm told, negative ads running against her, but she came the closest to flipping a district, 1.38%. So why did Democrats lose? So number one, I want to tell you is that DC consultants cannot win Texas races. They don't understand Texas. They don't understand how vast this is. When we talk about gerrymandering, we're not talking about just picking your voters. We are talking about vast swaths of rural land. And in rural precincts, in rural areas, Democrats are losing 90-10 Even a slight improvement there would put Texas over the edge. We must have a message for rural America. And DC consultants just don't get that. They don't understand how Texas is gerrymandered, how smart the GOP has been in order to make sure that Democrats never win races here that they don't want you to win. So number one. Number two is DC consultants are dependent on their paychecks. And I don't blame them, by the way, because for them, it's just a job, right? Of TV advertising. That's where they make their biggest money, 15% of TV advertising. And even in my district, where MJ Hagar raised $5 million and came really close in 2018, and in fact won Williamson County in 2018, lost Williamson County in 2020, reran ads constantly in the Austin market, in the Austin media market. So name ID, should have been good if TV advertising works. The point is this: you cannot win US congressional races by investing in a candidate at a local US congressional level with TV ads. That is what the data is telling you. Now, you can ignore the data or you can do something about it. What I'm trying to say is that it is important for us to increase name ID, but it's not necessarily the way the DC consultants are doing it. Now, I want to talk about digital, because there's a lot of talk about digital, how Democrats are running, really traditional races, not using digital. The interesting thing about digital is paid digital does not get you the type of name recognition that you think. And people say that, oh, the GOP, their digital is amazing. What is happening with the GOP is not really paid digital. There are people on forums, of hundreds and hundreds of forums, that are talking about politics that have nothing to do with politics. They might be talking about their hobbies, they might be talking about gardening, they might be talking about TV, but they're talking about politics in those forums. That is organic engagement. That is not paid digital. You can serve up all the ads, but it's just like running a TV ad on your phone or on your computer. You can serve up all the images you want. That does not help with persuasion. The point I'm trying to make here, guys, remember the chart I showed you between how many votes we got with so much less money in 2020 versus 2018 tells you this: you can spend all the money you like and you will increase name ID marginally, but you will not be able to persuade. And in Texas, the high-level Democratic Party messaging was not effective for down-ballot candidates. Republicans came out for two reasons. One, to keep Trump, and they did. Trump got millions of more votes across this country, including Texas, including my own district. Much more votes than he did in 2016. And some of the never Trumpers came out to vote against him, and they voted Republican down ballot for every single race. So if you look at every single race, there's a fall off between what happened at the top of the ballot and the bottom of the ballot. So even though Biden did perform much better than down ballot, that was because of a lot of Republicans who came out and either did not like Trump or never Trumpers, or thought, hey, we got our 3 Supreme Court justices, we got the biggest tax giveaway ever to corporations, and we got our majority that we wanted, all the things that we wanted to pass. What do we need Trump for anymore? We got hundreds of federal judges appointed by the Federalist Society, conservative judges. We don't really need Trump. We've used him for everything that we've needed to. So bottom line is that there's more potential to get Democrats out. Democrats are still not coming out in Texas in big numbers. Number one, maybe they believe that Texas is not flippable and their vote doesn't still count, because remember, that was the message just 4 years ago. If you look at the number of votes that the U.S. congressional candidate got in 2016, it's 72,000 less. Even with district growth, that's a huge deficit in numbers, number one. And number two, not only don't they believe that, and number two, they're not being inspired to come out. So what are the problems for the Democratic Party? I want to talk about some of the problems. We played a ton of defense, and I'll go over here as I talk through this over and over again. Instead of talking about how renewable energy was going to bring big jobs, we were on the defense on fracking over and over and over again. That came up in multiple debates. Instead of coming out with, hey, we should repeal qualified immunity, which would have been a very strong message and would have put the GOP on the defensive on why they don't want to repeal that. We said, we don't want to defund the police. That was the message from the top of the ticket. We don't want to stop fracking. We don't want to defund. We did not play offense in 2020. And this is some of the biggest problems. We do not have a strong economic message. Democrats are not perceived to be the party of the working people. That might sound strange to many of you that are watching this, but bottom line is we were on the defense on court packing. We were on the defense on defunding the police. We were on the defense when it came to fracking and many other topics for that matter. The point that I want to make over and over again is that we really we had no offensive message. And this is a big problem. And without a good, strong economic offensive message, we are not going to be able to inspire voters to come out and vote for something. And that's the most important thing I want you guys to take away from this. The GOP, in fact, in my district and across district, actually started saying that they were for covering pre-existing conditions. And I think they ran on that because they believed that the Democrats, got so many seats in the House. They expanded the majority in the House in 2018 because they ran on healthcare. And even though every single GOP candidate voted, not dozens, but like 6, 7, 8 times against protecting pre-existing conditions on ACA, they all campaigned that they were for that, and they were for law and order, and they were for tax cuts. Right now, Democrats lack an overall message. They're not perceived as the party of the working people. And instead of having a message for them, instead of putting the GOP on the offensive, saying, you've had 8 years, okay? Since the first 2 years of Obama, you've been the majority in Congress, and you don't have a solution for lowering the cost of healthcare. And you don't have a solution for homelessness. You don't have a solution for mental health. You don't have a solution for wasting our money and giving corporate, giveaways, literally, handouts all the time. You don't have a solution. Instead of putting them on the defensive, we play defense, and you can't win with just defense. I want to end this part with one thing, and that I know that there's a lot of clash within the Democratic Party, but I think one of the things that we can all agree on is that we want to bring healthcare to every single person in our country. We are the party that believes that people should have a high wage job so they're not struggling. We are the party that believes that you should not have to be in debt to get an education. There are messages that every single person underneath the big Democratic umbrella, no matter how left you are, how centrist you are, there are messages we can come together on. We need to pick those economic messages, and if we pick those economic messages, we can come together. I think the more we destroy our party from within, the less chances we have of flipping places like Texas. So the last part I want to get to is, so how do we win? And so we're in the how we win Texas, and this is going to be nice, short, and sweet. So I have some very key directives here that hopefully will be of importance. So number one, we need to play offense. I've already talked about this. So how do you play offense? You need a strong economic message. That message needs to be a jobs message. One of the things I want you to understand is the $15 an hour message is a very outdated message. Not only that you can't live on $15 an hour in any big city, but more importantly, that most people who are working class, so maybe doing blue collar jobs, maybe in construction, house cleaning, even in Texas, are not getting paid $15 an hour. In Austin, in Williamson County, in the suburbs here, you cannot hire people for anything less than $25 an hour. The $15 an hour message is just going over the head. It does not make sense. It is completely outdated. If you want to win Texas, you got to win the Latino vote. And there's nothing There's nothing that works as well as high wage jobs and focus on entrepreneurship and business. You want to win the black vote? Help entrepreneurship, help small businesses, help bring high wage jobs. You will get the Latino vote. You will get the immigrant vote, because why do immigrants come to the United States of America? For a better life. There is not a single person that is going home and saying, guess what? I just got a $15 an hour job. How exciting is my life? People want to be able to say, I have a 6-figure job. I'm saving up. I almost have enough money for a down payment on that home. I am able to go buy a brand new car and I can afford those car payments, and I have job security. Once I get that car, I know I'm going to be able to make those payments over the next 3 to 5 years because I will have that job. That is the inspiration we need to give them. If we can bring a strong national economic message, we will win Texas, guaranteed. So that's number one. Number two, this message has to come at a national level, top of ticket messaging. Remember, I went over and over and over again. In every single race, other than a few outliers, everybody trailed Biden by 1 to 3 points. Without a strong national level message, local level message gets lost. It is impossible for every single person to know every single candidate and understand what their message is. In fact, in Travis County, and I gave this example earlier today, I would call my friends and I would say, hey, are you in Julia Oliver's district, Mike Siegel's district, or Wendy Davis' district? Who's your US congressional candidate? They'd be like, I don't know. I'm like, what do you mean you don't know? You're going to vote, right? Like, oh, I already voted. Oh, really? Who'd you vote for? Don't remember. Why? I just vote straight ticket Democrat. I just voted every Democrat. Well, did you get any advertising? Yeah, I get advertisements every single day. I see them on TV. I don't know who they are. I just throw them out. So you see what I'm trying to get to is that local level messaging did not impact the races, and you cannot invest locally and win races. You have to invest at the top of the ticket. So in 2022, the top of the ticket in Texas, there's not going to be a U.S. presidential race. There is not going to be a U.S. Senate race. There will only be the governor's race. That is the ticket that is going to be the most important national message for Texas if you want to make strides in a race. The third thing I want to talk about is this message needs to be cohesive. Every single Democrat needs to run on the same message, and it needs to be, and by the way, the DCCC will agree with this point. They might not agree on the exact message, but they'll agree on the cohesiveness. But we need a cohesive Democratic message for it to really make impact. If you want to win Texas, you have to have a message for rural Americans. And I mentioned this earlier. Democrats are losing rural precincts 90 to 10. You will not change that with canvassing. You will not change that with phone banking. It will have minimal impact. And the reason is this. People talk about organizing, and organizing works really well in a small race, in a primary. But in a U.S. congressional race where in my district almost 400,000 people voted, 400,000 people, you cannot scale canvassing, you cannot scale phone banking, and even if you're able to get someone on the phone, you cannot have a constructive conversation to persuade. All you can do is get name ID. Right now, people in Texas do not trust Democrats with the economy for whatever reason, right? We talked about all the reasons prior, but we need a strong national message, and it must address rural Americans. And leaving out rural America is wrong for our country. It is wrong. We must address them. They're Americans. They are, in many cases, the source of food security for our country, okay? We need them. We need to help them. They have some of the worst healthcare outcomes in rural America. They don't have clinics. They don't have hospitals. It is so important and so easy for us to take a broadband message to rural America. Democrats are going to get broadband to every single rural county. Democrats are going to bring a healthcare clinic to every single rural county. And you win these precincts hands down with that kind of national message. And last but not the least, Democrats really didn't have a strong message for young people. Now, I know a lot of people talked about, we had more young people come out in this election than ever before. But if you look at the percentage of growth, and I looked at data in my district specifically, young people did not come out in a big force with respect to the number of registered young people. The percentage was very, very low. We need a strong message for young Americans. So these are my 5 recommendations on how you win Texas. We must play offense on these 5 points. And we must put the GOP on the defensive. And the way you put the GOP on defensive is you point out the fact that they have had majority in the US Congress for a long time. They had 8 years and they had no solution for healthcare. So 8 years, 2 years after Obama and 2 years into Trump's presidency, 8 years of majority in US Congress and no solution for healthcare. That is something that they need to be held accountable for. Number 2, their corporate handouts are killing small businesses. Just today, there was an article that small businesses got such a small percentage, more than 50% of the PPP money, the small business loan money through SBA went to 5% of large corporations and large companies, national chains. Did not go to small business. A strong small business message put the GOP on the defensive. They are killing small businesses, which is the foundation of the United States. They have nothing on entrepreneurship and small businesses. And last, and this is a very, very important point before I conclude this, is that when it comes to technology innovation and diversifying our energy sources, we are way behind. In a couple of years, we're going to see China and India really, really accelerate beyond us when it comes to low-cost energy, because they are diversifying. They are into renewables and they're investing in that in a big way. And by the way, this whole obsession with fossil fuels, not only is it bad for the climate, the point is that fossil fuels are not going to be cost effective when it comes to renewables. So we will fall behind the rest of the world. And once we fall behind in innovation, especially technology and innovation, more than 50% of the money in 2019 and 2018 in machine learning and AI went to China. Investment went into Chinese companies, not the United States companies. So we got to put the GOP on the offensive. Winning Texas can be done, but we need a strong, offensive, economic message. We need to put the GOP on the defense, and this is our path to victory. So with that, I want to thank you. If you stuck through this entire presentation, I really, really appreciate it. I want to thank you for your time. And if there are, if you want to reach out to me, if you have any other questions or you think of them, get in touch and I'd be happy to answer them. But I really, really appreciate your time. And with that,